Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of a Shabbat sermon by Rabbi Adam Kligfeld.
For those of you who may remember or heard about a certain Yom Kippur sermon a few years ago, I want you to rest assured that this sermon is not about eating plants. Okay? You can eat whatever you want. But I did want to go back to a period in my life, just for a moment. I had that effect. I want to go back just for a moment to a period of my life that began a trajectory that, as many of you know, ultimately ended in a decision to be a plant-based eater. But it began much earlier than that. It began in 2008, I believe, when I was doing some research for a sermon that I was going to be giving on the high holidays in my former community in New York. And the topic of the sermon, the title of the sermon, was why offer a peck when you can really give a kiss? And I meant it both in our interpersonal relationships and also in our observance of Judaism and mitzvot. And I started thinking about kashrut and how a lot of modern kashrut, even for the most observant and frum of people, is a peck. We're not really thinking when we make these decisions and choose this hechsher over another hechsher about elevating our eating to divine consumption. We're checking off boxes, as many of us do in many aspects of our lives, religious and personal. And it may be that passive observance of a mitzvah gets you some kind of celestial credit, but it can leave you with a dried out, desiccated relationship with God and with Torah and with Judaism. And because of that research, I started my own personal trajectory to make my kashrut, my choices of what I eat, more in line with what I understand to be a divine expectation of what a human being should do and eat. Thinking about that now 16 years later reminds me of a rather fantastical story from the Zohar. The Zohar is Judaism's most central and complicated mystical text. If you're going to take in a story from the Zohar, you have to suspend disbelief a bit. It's the rabbis rhapsodizing about amazing experiences that they had with one another and with God in this world and the next. You have to go into the labyrinth and expect to not really know where you're going to end up. And the Zohar is attributed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who lived in the Talmudic era. And there's the following story in the Zohar. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai dies, leaves this world. And one of his prized students, Rabbi Chia, he misses him. They had a special bond. Rabbi Chia loved to study at the feet of his teacher and to take in all that he was communicating about Torah and life. And so, in the Zohar, Rabbi Chia goes searching for him in Olam Haba, in the world to come. In the imagination of the Zohar, a rabbi could do that. Just find the pathway to Olam Haba. He wanted to commune with his teacher. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was known as a mystical man constantly searching for the magic in every moment. And Rabbi Chia was known as a punctilious teacher. Very, very precise in all of his teachings and observances. But they were different. Rabbi Chia finds the gates to Olam Haba. He's standing at the entrance to the world to come. And there are gatekeepers there. And the Zohar says that he asks for his teacher, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who's known as the Rashbi, according to his initials. And the gatekeepers go find Rashbi. What's he doing? He's teaching in the celestial yeshiva, giving a class. And when the gatekeepers come to tell him that his student Rabbi Chia is there waiting for him, he says to the gatekeepers, give this message to Rabbi Chia. The message is, Who among you has transformed darkness into light? And have you transformed the taste of bitter into sweet? Are you among the people who have awaited eagerly every day the light that shines? Because one who does not await eagerly for that has no part in this place. The Zohar says that his teacher denies Rabbi Chia access to Olam Haba. It's a subtle but very real critique of his student and of the type of Torah taught by Rabbi Chia, who was an honored and honorable man. That when you live without splendor and you live without awe, if you live your Judaism and your life with a peck and not a kiss, something's missing. He was telling his student, you're alive, Rabbi Chia, and I'm not. But you're barely awake. There's a Hasidic teaching on one of the verses in this week's Parsha, one of the verses that Liana read so beautifully as part of the Tochacha, the reproof that God gives in advance to the Israelites for what's going to happen to them if they don't follow the commandments of the land of Israel. It's offered by Rabbi Avram of Sokochev, which was one of the rabbis of the Sokochever dynasties in Poland. He lived in the late 18th, early 19th century. And it's on one of the many times in that Tochacha, and Liana knows those verses well, where God gives the following situation. Something like this in this verse. V'im telchu imi keri. If, when you get to the land of Israel, telchu imi, you walk with me keri, kuf resh yud. Commentators throughout the centuries have tried to figure out what does that word keri mean. Some people believe it comes from the root kar, which means cold. If you walk through the world with me with a cold heart, the consequence will come. But Rabbi Avram of Sokochev connects it not to cold, but to the word mikre, which means accident, by happenstance, something done with the opposite of intent. And what's interesting is, this sin of walking with God Bekeri earns one of the most severe punishments in the whole list. That God is going to pay you, sort of punish you for your sins 7 times what you deserve to be punished. The worst punishment in this list is not offered, he says, for the abrogation of the law, not for not following the mitzvot, but for doing everything you're supposed to do, kind of by accident, as if you haven't really thought about it, as if it just happened by happenstance. The worst punishment is for doing the law and fulfilling your obligations, but with no attention and no intention, no preparation and no presence. That early 19th century critique burns really harshly, particularly in this generation. How many of us can think back to a moment recently where we were talking to our beloved with our face in the phone? Or being in the same room as your child, but focused on the newspaper and the headlines and the doom scrolling. Or praying, as you might already have done today and might do in the next few minutes, and saying the words, and rushing to finish, and never letting the experience penetrate, or even having a chance to penetrate. I was talking about this topic with my dear friend, Rabbi David Ingber. He's a rabbi of Romamu, New York. I asked him, what did this teaching bring up for him? And he says it reminded him, or it brought up for him, the contrast between, on the one hand, fake it until you make it, and living what he calls a pretend life, a pretend love. Fake it until you make it is actually admirable and obligatory in some aspects of life. It takes a certain courage and discipline to go through the valleys that appear in all relationships and with things and people that matter. You go through those valleys to earn the peaks because you know the peaks are possible. You engineer yourself back towards those peaks with a little bit of intentional faking it so that you have a chance of making it. But it's another thing entirely to be just pretending because you don't have the energy. could you give yourself permission to be absent, even when you're pretending to be present? And who gets injured in those moments, those missed moments of relationship between you and others, and you and God, and you and Torah? They get injured, whoever the they are. The bond itself gets injured. And you do too. Maybe even sevenfold, as if the Torah was prescient. Fake it until you make it, on one level, is how we reawaken the life of the Spirit and the possibility of ecstasy in all forms. Rabbi Avram of Sokachev and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in the Zohar was saying, just don't pretend to be making it when you're actually faking it. Dr. Melila Hellner-Eshed, who's one of the world's leading experts on the Kabbalah, teaches, among other places, at the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. She's a scholar of the Zohar. This is one of her favorite stories in all the Zohar, and this is her take on that story of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and Rabbi Chia. She says, on the one hand, it's a little bit harsh in Rabbi Chia. It's harsh in anyone who feels like they're being held to too high a standard in life and in love and in spirit. It's hard to maintain that. And she identifies with the desire to, in her words, stay asleep. Sometimes we want to stay asleep when we're awake. She says we need to sleep. We need to rest. We need to give our bodies and minds a break from the relentless obligations of relationships of all sorts. And it can be hard and it can be tiring to push yourself to fully wake up. On the other hand, she says, what treasures are you missing out on as you slumber through prayer, as you nap through Shabbat, as you go through the motions in Kashrut, and as your eyes close, as it were, through all the moments that are meant to matter? We need to wake up to see the world for what it is and to help make it what it can be. And we need to see our loved ones for who they are deeply. And when we sleep, we might spare ourselves some pain and some challenge and the weight of responsibility. But we also lose some of the greatest parts of being alive. And we lose the chance to motivate us to higher, loftier loving and living. The poet Rumi put it succinctly. He said, "Come, friends. We're trying to stay awake. Come, friends. We're trying to stay awake." I hear this line in Parshat B'chukotai screaming at us. Wake yourself up. Don't do the mitzvot simply by rote. Don't be Jewish by accident. Don't be human by happenstance. Don't live without living.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.